The laughter was the first thing that broke the silence of the executive conference room. Gerald Vance, the vice president of operations at Vanguard Precision Systems, threw his head back, his voice bouncing off the polished mahogany table and the glass walls. He looked at me as if I had just told the most hilarious joke of the decade. I sat perfectly still in my leather chair, my hands resting flat on the quarterly performance review folder open before me. Inside that folder was the undeniable record of my contributions. 9 years of exceptional evaluations, 9 years of arriving before sunrise, and 9 years without a single increase in my base salary. Rebecca Finch, the chief financial officer, tilted her head with an exaggerated expression of sympathy that did not reach her eyes. She told me that my request was ambitious, especially considering the current volatile market conditions. Around the long table, the leadership team exchanged knowing, smug glances. There were 8 people in that room, 8 executives who collectively made decisions about my livelihood and my value, yet not one of them knew the actual technical details of what I did for the company day in and day out. I kept my voice calm and steady as I addressed them, refusing to let their condescension shake my composure. I reminded them that I had personally developed the calibration method that increased our manufacturing precision by 45%. I pointed out that my technique had cut production time by 60%, allowing us to double our output without hiring additional staff. I reminded them of the lucrative Eastbrook contract, which we had secured through aggressive negotiation tactics. Julian Croft, the vice president of sales, interrupted me, claiming that the sales team had won that deal. However, everyone in the room knew it was my advanced technical specifications and custom calibration standards that had convinced the client we were the only firm capable of meeting their tolerance requirements. I went on, noting that I had trained 22 junior technicians since my arrival, ensuring that the assembly floor ran like a finely tuned machine. I also reminded them that the critical European expansion would have collapsed entirely in my 6th year if I had not spent 8 consecutive weekends redesigning our core protocols to meet foreign regulatory standards, which finally allowed us to pass inspection in the 9th week. Gerald Vance drummed his fingers on the table, dismissing my words as a team effort. He told me that everyone pulled their weight at Vanguard and that my salary was fair. I looked him dead in the eye and stated that my compensation had not changed since the day I was hired and that I was simply asking to align my salary with current industry standards. Gerald leaned back, sharing an amused smirk with Rebecca. He told me that industry standards were meant for average contributors, and that if I wanted extraordinary compensation, I needed to show extraordinary results. My chest tightened, but I did not show my anger. The calibration breakthrough I had pioneered had generated millions of dollars for the firm. I had seen last quarter's internal report, which I was not supposed to access, showing a 36% profit increase directly attributed to my proprietary technical innovations. The numbers spoke for themselves, and I slid my market research across the table, showing that engineers with my qualifications were compensated at least 42% higher elsewhere. Gerald did not even glance at the documents. He pushed them back to me and repeated that I should be grateful they kept me on the payroll. I stood up slowly, closing the review folder. I reached into my jacket pocket, placed a white sealed envelope in the center of the table, and thanked them for their time. I walked out of the room, leaving them to their laughter. That moment ended my 9 years of dedication, but as I walked back to my workstation, a profound sense of clarity came over me. My name is Daniel Porter, and until that morning, I was the lead calibration engineer at Vanguard Precision Systems. My passion for precision started when I was 14 years old, when I completely disassembled and rebuilt our household vacuum cleaner to achieve double its original suction power. By 19, I had modified the university physics lab equipment to measure tolerances that the department's budget could not otherwise afford. My professors called me Precision Dan, a nickname that followed me throughout my career. When I first joined Vanguard, I was grateful for the opportunity, believing that hard work would lead to growth. But over the years, I watched newer employees, mostly younger men with less than half my experience, negotiate starting salaries that were far higher than mine. When I had questioned human resources, they claimed they could not disrupt internal equity by adjusting established employees. That was when I realized the corporate game was rigged, and I stopped asking for raises and started preparing my exit. My breakthrough calibration method had been developed during my second year at Vanguard. I had spent months identifying tiny variations in our testing apparatus that others dismissed as acceptable errors. I worked late into the nights using my own tools purchased from my modest salary. The solution finally came to me at 2 o'clock in the morning. I created a hybrid approach that integrated digital measurements with mechanical fine-tuning in a sequence that had never been attempted. When I demonstrated it to the team, the results were immediate and undeniable. Production calibration time dropped from 8 hours to under 3 hours, and product quality skyrocketed. The company celebrated the massive influx of new clients, but in the next quarterly meeting, my innovation was presented as a proprietary company method with no mention of my name. Gavin Ross, my colleague, had whispered to me that this was how the corporate world worked and told me to be patient. I was patient for 7 more years, but that patience ended today. The resignation letter that I drafted later that evening was brief, professional, and entirely devoid of emotion. I sat at my kitchen table for nearly an hour, watching the rain beat against the window pane as I carefully selected my words. I wrote only 2 paragraphs, stating that I would be departing Vanguard Precision Systems in 3 weeks and would do everything in my power to ensure that all my ongoing projects were fully transitioned. I did not include any complaints about the frozen wages, and I made no accusations about the unfair treatment I had endured. I simply stated that I had accepted another professional opportunity that aligned with my career goals. It felt liberating to seal that envelope. The next morning, I arrived at the facility at my usual early hour. I went about my work as if nothing had changed, addressing urgent calibration requests from our field technicians. At precisely 10:15 in the morning, I walked to the executive conference room where the leadership team was holding their daily briefing. The security guard at the door looked surprised to see me, but I nodded politely and walked in. I walked straight to the table and placed the envelope in the center, directly in front of Gerald Vance. I looked at the surprised faces of the executives, said that I appreciated their time, and walked back to my desk without waiting for a reply. Surprisingly, the envelope remained unopened for 5 days. The executives assumed it was merely a written rebuttal to my annual review, or perhaps a formal request for another meeting, so they left it sitting on Gerald Vance's desk. During those 5 days, I continued my daily routine, ensuring that my documentation was updated and that my colleagues were supported. I did not discuss the resignation letter with anyone, and the executives chose to ignore my brief appearance at their meeting. I knew that they believed I was simply sulking and would eventually fall back into my regular duties without causing any further issues. They completely underestimated the determination that had built up in me over 9 years. On the morning of the 5th day, my phone began vibrating continuously in my pocket. When I finally checked it, I saw that I had received 8 missed calls from Human Resources, 5 from Gerald Vance, and 3 from Rebecca Finch. I turned the device off, completed the calibration of a critical piece of aerospace testing equipment, and then walked back to my desk. Brenda Miller, the Human Resources representative, was waiting for me. She asked if we could speak privately, her tone remarkably soft and anxious compared to her usual detached demeanor. I followed her to the conference room, where Gerald and Rebecca were waiting. Gerald pushed my letter toward me, asking what it meant. I told him it was my 3 weeks' notice, as I had accepted a role elsewhere. Rebecca immediately demanded to know the identity of my new employer, but I declined to answer, stating that I would share that information in due time. The atmosphere in the room changed instantly. The arrogance they had displayed during my review was replaced by visible desperation. Gerald explained that the leadership team had been under immense pressure during my evaluation and offered to revisit my compensation. Brenda added that my contributions were highly valued. Rebecca promised that whatever my new employer had offered, Vanguard would match it. I thought about the 9 years of denied requests, the missed family events, and how they had claimed credit for my hard work. I told them that my decision was final. Desperate, Gerald offered to create a senior technical specialist position with an entire team reporting directly to me. When I declined, they continued to escalate their offers, eventually promising a 75% salary increase, a director title, and a permanent seat on the innovation committee. I declined every offer. The remaining 3 weeks of my notice period were surreal. Colleagues who had ignored me for years suddenly wanted to take me out to lunch, and executives who had never remembered my name visited my workstation to ask technical questions about our calibration systems. I spent my remaining time ensuring that my departure would not leave the technicians stranded. I compiled 3,150 pages of technical documentation and recorded 175 detailed training videos. I spent hours setting up the camera in the lab, walking through each calibration sequence, explaining the technical terms of the machinery, and showing how to handle calibration drift. I organized every file and uploaded them to the shared network, making sure that my methods were accessible to anyone who needed them. On my last day, I transitioned my projects to 3 different engineers and cleared my desk in less than 10 minutes. Gerald Vance intercepted me in the lobby, claiming that I was throwing away 9 years of hard work. I handed my security badge to the receptionist and told Gerald that those years had provided excellent experience. When he insisted on knowing where I was going, I looked him in the eye and told him I had accepted the position of Chief Innovation Officer at the Global Standard Certification Bureau. His face went pale and his voice dropped to a whisper, but I simply turned and walked out. I took a 4-week vacation before starting my new position. It was the first real break I had enjoyed since graduating from college. I traveled to Michigan to visit my parents, hiked along the shores of Lake Michigan, and enjoyed the quiet of the mornings without an alarm clock. The cool lake breeze felt like a physical washing away of the stress and exhaustion that had accumulated in my bones. During those 4 weeks, I declined 22 calls from Vanguard numbers, deleting their voicemails without listening to them. I needed to clear my mind and prepare for the challenges ahead, knowing that my new role at the Certification Bureau would give me the power to shape the entire industry. On my first day at the Global Standard Certification Bureau, Eleanor Foster, the executive director, welcomed me and showed me to my new office. It was a spacious room with large windows and a solid door, a stark contrast to the shared, noisy workstation I had occupied at Vanguard Precision Systems for 9 years. Eleanor was a respected figure in the engineering world, known for her commitment to rigorous quality control. She explained that the industry certification standards had not been updated in nearly a decade, and that while manufacturing technology had advanced, their regulations had lagged behind. My primary mandate was to modernize our precision measurement and calibration protocols to reflect modern capabilities. I spent my first month analyzing our existing framework, reading historical reports, and identifying outdated requirements. By my 8th week, I had drafted a preliminary set of revisions that would raise the industry standards. I spent hours analyzing how the old guidelines allowed manufacturers to hide operational inefficiencies, which frequently led to minor product failures that went unreported. These gaps in the previous guidelines had created a system where quality was sacrificed for short-term profits. Quentin Shaw, our technical review director, raised concerns during our planning meeting, noting that several manufacturers would struggle to comply with such strict tolerances. I explained to him that any company utilizing modern best practices would easily meet the standards, and that the revisions would only impact those that used outdated equipment or took dangerous shortcuts, such as ignoring calibration drift, to save operational costs. Quentin stood near the whiteboard, tracing lines showing compliance margins. He argued that the smaller manufacturers would not be able to upgrade their hardware in time. I countered by explaining that we were not asking them to purchase state-of-the-art lasers, but simply to perform their manual calibration with proper oversight and documentation. I showed him that by neglecting basic calibration routines, these firms were putting critical components at risk of failing within a few thousand cycles, which was an unacceptable risk for components used in medical ventilators and automotive systems. Quentin listened intently, nodding slowly, as the logic of the new protocols became clear. We spent days debating the economic impact on the manufacturing sector, but I remained firm that public safety and quality could not be compromised for corporate convenience. The standards revision process required 4 months of meticulous work, peer reviews, and consultations with industry experts. I maintained strict professional ethics throughout, ensuring that the new requirements were fair, objective, and based entirely on scientific precision levels that I had personally achieved years earlier. The entire process was documented with extreme detail to ensure that no single company could claim they were being targeted. When the updated standards were officially published, my office phone rang within hours. It was Gavin Ross from Vanguard. He sounded incredibly stressed, his voice shaking as he spoke. He told me that the new precision requirements and mandatory calibration schedules were practically impossible to meet. I told him that they were not impossible, as I had implemented similar standards at Vanguard 4 years ago, though they had been rejected by management due to implementation costs. Gavin was silent for a long moment before admitting that Vanguard's certification renewal was due the following month, and that their current setup was nowhere near compliant. He described the panic in the engineering department, explaining that the senior leadership was refusing to invest in new calibration rigs and was demanding that the engineers find a way to cheat the measurements. I maintained my professional distance, informing him that the Bureau offered official implementation consulting for transitioning firms and offered to refer him to that department. Gavin declined, and I later learned that Vanguard had hired an expensive external consultant to help them bypass the hurdles. 3 weeks later, Vanguard requested an expedited pre-assessment review to evaluate their certification status. To avoid any conflict of interest, the review was assigned to Harvey Stone, a senior inspector who had no history with my former employer. I made sure to recuse myself from the physical inspection process entirely, allowing Harvey to conduct the audit without any influence from my office. The inspector's final report arrived on my desk with a major red flag. Vanguard's calibration procedures were severely outdated, their measurements were inconsistent, and their quality control documentation was practically non-existent. Harvey Stone had noted in his report that the company was using outdated testing rigs that had not been serviced in years, relying on temporary adjustments rather than proper maintenance. He discovered that baseline tolerances had been artificially adjusted in the software to mask mechanical misalignment. The technicians admitted that they had been ordered to bypass the diagnostic errors to keep the line moving. I forwarded the report to the certification committee, with standard recommendations for compliance improvement. 4 days later, Gerald Vance called my direct line. He did not greet me. Instead, he angrily claimed that these new standards were designed to target Vanguard specifically and that my actions were a personal vendetta for denying my raise. He accused me of using my new position to punish the company. I calmly informed him that our conversation was being recorded as per Bureau policy and asked if he wanted to rephrase his statement for the record. Gerald hung up immediately, the line going dead with a sharp click. When their review came due, the committee granted Vanguard a provisional certification only, with mandatory compliance audits every 45 days. This provisional status was a devastating blow, preventing them from securing new contracts and forcing them to disclose their non-compliant status to existing clients. I returned from a conference in Vienna to find 38 urgent messages from Vanguard executives, all of which I forwarded to our compliance officer to maintain transparency. The annual industry summit took place 9 months after the publication of the new standards in Denver, Colorado. I was invited to deliver the keynote address on precision requirements for next-generation manufacturing, a presentation that drew industry leaders from around the world. The Grand Hotel Conference Hall was packed with delegates. As I stood on the stage, looking out at the audience of over 500 manufacturing experts, I felt a sense of pride. My slides detailed the correlation between strict precision standards and reduced warranty claims. I presented data showing that companies adopting the new guidelines saw a 30% drop in manufacturing defects and a significant increase in operational efficiency. I explained that upgrading equipment paid for itself by eliminating defects. As the charts flashed on the screen, I watched the Vanguard leadership team sitting in the front row. They were taking notes with intense concentration, their faces showing the strain of the past 9 months of provisional audits and operational struggles. Gerald Vance sat with crossed arms, his brow furrowed, while Rebecca Finch stared at the floor, refusing to look at the screen. They knew that their competitors were already gaining market share by advertising their full compliance with our new certification guidelines. The contrast between our success and Vanguard's failure was stark. During the networking reception afterward, Julian Croft, the vice president of sales, approached me with a forced smile. He told me that Vanguard had hired 5 compliance specialists and spent $10 million on equipment upgrades to meet the new standards. He added, with a touch of irony, that these upgrades were the exact same ones I had requested in my final budget proposals years ago. Julian lowered his voice and claimed that they were still struggling with the calibration protocols because the documentation I had left behind was incomplete. He mentioned that the sales department was in serious trouble, having lost 2 major prospective deals because the clients demanded GSCB compliance, which Vanguard could not provide under provisional status. I corrected him immediately, stating that the documentation I left was comprehensive for the systems Vanguard utilized at the time, but the new standards required modern methodologies that they had failed to adopt. Julian then revealed that Gerald wanted to meet with me privately to discuss high-paying consulting opportunities. I maintained a polite smile and informed him that Bureau employees were strictly prohibited from consulting for certified entities as it represented a serious conflict of interest. Julian pressed further, stating that they were prepared to make it highly lucrative for me. I looked at him and stated firmly that such an arrangement would be illegal, and that his line of questioning was becoming entirely inappropriate. The reception hall was decorated with huge ice sculptures of mechanical gears, and a jazz band played softly in the corner, contrasting with the tense technical conversations happening at every table. Julian Croft was sweating, his fingers leaving wet marks on his champagne glass. As I turned to leave, Julian grabbed my arm, his desperation breaking through his professional facade. He told me that if Vanguard did not achieve full certification by the end of the quarter, they would lose the Eastbrook contract, which represented 45% of their annual revenue. I gently but firmly removed his hand from my arm and suggested that he focus his company's resources on actually meeting the standards rather than trying to circumvent them. A few minutes later, Rebecca Finch intercepted me near the exit. She attempted to use artificial warmth, complimenting my success and asking to discuss a new division Vanguard was creating. She claimed the board had authorized an exceptional compensation package for me to lead their new precision technology division. She suggested that my return would restore confidence and save the jobs of my former colleagues. She promised that I would have complete authority over all quality control budgets, bypassing Gerald Vance entirely. She argued that my past years at Vanguard proved that I had a deep loyalty to the brand, and that we could rebuild it together to become the market leader in the entire region. She tried to persuade me by describing the new facilities they were planning to build, which would include a state-of-the-art laboratory designed exactly to my specifications. I listened to her, recognizing that these promises were merely bait to lure me back into their cage. I looked at her and asked if she was offering me a job. She admitted they needed someone who understood their unique challenges and could help them navigate the certification timelines. I told her that our guidelines offered realistic timelines for companies committed to quality and walked away. Finally, Gerald Vance himself stepped out of a side hallway to block my path. He looked exhausted, his usual arrogant stride replaced by a tense, hesitant posture. His face was weathered by stress and lack of sleep. He asked for just 3 minutes of my time. Gerald admitted that they had made a terrible mistake by undervaluing me and begged me to consult for them, telling me to name my price. He offered a blank check, saying they would pay whatever I wanted if I would agree to consult for them during their upcoming audit. I looked at the man who had laughed at my hard work and denied my compensation, and replied that I was quite grateful for my current position, repeating the exact words he had used to dismiss me. Gerald glared at me and warned that this was not over. I looked back and agreed that it was not over, but warned him that for Vanguard, the trouble was only beginning. I knew what he did not, that the regulatory changes were just the first step, and my actual plan to bring accountability to the industry was now entering its final phase. 2 weeks after the summit, financial news outlets reported that Vanguard Precision Systems had secured an emergency high-interest loan to fund their compliance upgrades. They were burning through their cash reserves to keep their operations afloat. At the Certification Bureau, my team launched the second phase of our modernization initiative, the Transparent Attribution Framework. This new system required certified manufacturers to formally document and credit all technical innovations to the individual developers who created them. This system required companies to submit a detailed ledger of all technicians, engineers, and designers who contributed to any certified process or mechanical design. When a company applied for certification renewal, they had to prove that their internal compensation and recognition policies matched the contributions recorded in the ledger. This mechanism prevented companies from claiming collective ownership of an individual's breakthrough without providing proper credit and financial compensation. The board members debated the administrative burden this would place on smaller companies, but I showed them that a simple digital registry would automate the process. The board chair, a veteran inspector named Walter Miller, supported the motion, stating that it was time to end the practice of corporations absorbing employee breakthroughs without credit. The board approved the framework, making it voluntary for the first year and mandatory the next. Gavin Ross visited my office a few days later, having accepted a job at our bureau. Gavin sat in the chair across from my desk, looking exhausted. He told me that after my departure, Gerald Vance had ordered a full audit of my computer files, searching for evidence that I had deleted critical data. Gerald had blamed the engineering staff for the failed pre-assessment, accusing them of incompetence. Gavin said that 5 of our senior colleagues had been fired in a single afternoon as scapegoats for the leadership's failure to upgrade the testing equipment. Gerald had demanded the team sign documents, claiming they had never received the transition files from me. Gavin and the others refused to sign the false statements, resulting in their immediate terminations. He also warned me that Gerald Vance was preparing a formal complaint alleging that I had a conflict of interest and had manipulated the standards to target Vanguard. I thanked Gavin for the warning but remained unconcerned. My transition and standards development had been fully documented, peer-reviewed, and approved. When Vanguard filed their complaint, I forwarded it to our legal team and requested they initiate Protocol 37, our standard comprehensive review of standards development. 8 weeks later, the Oversight Board held a hearing in a formal chamber. Gerald Vance and his legal team presented their case, claiming that I had deliberately withheld calibration sequences to make compliance impossible for Vanguard. The board chair, Walter Miller, listened patiently before presenting the Ethics Committee's findings. The audit showed that upon my departure, I had left 3,150 pages of technical documentation and 175 training videos, exceeding standard transition practices by 420%. The committee revealed that the calibration sequences Gerald claimed were missing were actually fully documented in Section 14.4 and Appendices D through H of my transition files. When Walter Miller asked Gerald if he had personally reviewed the documentation, Gerald hesitated. An IT representative admitted that they had found the documents but were ordered by Gerald to keep them hidden to support their false complaint. Gerald's team was stunned as the complaint completely fell apart. The failed complaint triggered a wider investigation by the Industry Oversight Board and federal regulators. Investigators uncovered that Vanguard's leadership had violated Section 10B of the Securities Exchange Act of 1934 and Rule 10b-5 by making material misrepresentations in their investor communications. They had claimed proprietary ownership of advanced calibration technologies that were actually my uncredited work, inflating their stock price. Consequently, Vanguard's stock dropped by 75%, and Eastbrook officially terminated their contract. Facing potential job losses for 600 employees, Gerald Vance and 2 other executives were suspended. Rebecca Finch visited my office, pleading for a settlement. She offered public recognition, back pay, and naming rights for the calibration method, calling it the Porter calibration method. I told her that the only path forward was for Vanguard to adopt the attribution framework and publicly admit the truth. Vanguard's board agreed, making them the 4th company to adopt the framework. They published a public reconciliation acknowledging 34 engineers, with my name leading the list for 22 distinct innovations over my 9 years of service. Gerald and his executives resigned, and the company stabilized under a new engineering-focused CEO. The new CEO, Lawrence Fowler, who was promoted from the engineering division, introduced a transparent compensation structure tied directly to innovation contributions. He believed that the company's survival depended on restoring trust. Lawrence Fowler reached out to me personally on his first day, promising that the old corporate games were gone and that they were committed to compliance and honesty. 6 months later, Vanguard achieved full certification. At the next summit, I presented the attribution framework, which was now adopted by 80% of manufacturers. During the questions session, Clara Jenkins, my ex-girlfriend who now worked for a competitor, asked about the corporate impact. I responded that innovation without attribution is merely appropriation, and that ethical companies ultimately perform better. I look back at my journey, realizing that my goal was never simple revenge, but rather building an industry where excellence is valued and protected. As the audience applauded, I felt a sense of peace, knowing that my 9 years of struggle had paved the way for a fairer workplace for everyone who followed.